Hi everyone, I'm Jack Fremling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. We have set sail on Sagalong 2023, and our main saga for this year is an excellent work, the Saga of Grettir the Strong, and I hope you're enjoying it if you're reading it with us, because it really is just a fascinating work. This is the last of the great Icelandic sagas. It dates from the end of the 14th century. So while these stories about Grettir, and in some cases songs, had existed in an oral tradition for 300 years, it's very much the last one to be written down, and it's being written down in a room that has the other sagas on the shelves of the library. And so there are explicit references to those. And there are also thematic references. There are ways in which it seems that this anonymous author has drawn the best bits. We have the characterization of Egil from Egil's Saga and how just strange he was. We have the concept of justice and the way that cultural changes are occurring in Njal's Saga. We have that drawn in, and we have mentions of the Althing. And we even have the sort of scope of the Laxardal saga and references to how this connects to those. So all of those elements are being drawn together. We have the great battle set pieces drawn in and stitched together to just really create one of the best sagas. And so, as I said, I hope you're enjoying it. Grettir himself is a fascinating character. When we're introduced to him as a boy, he is not the best worker. So his father, Asmund Greylocks, gets to work. So Grettir grew up at Bjarg to the age of 10. He began to develop then, and Asmund told him he would have to do some work on the farm. Grettir answered that he was not suited for it, but asked all the same what he was supposed to do. Asmund said, "You will look after the geese I am rearing." "A trifling job for weaklings," Grettir said. "Do the job well," said Asmund, "and we'll get on better." Grettir took charge of the geese. There were 50 of them, and many goslings as well. Before long, he began to have trouble rounding them up, and thought the goslings were tedious, which infuriated him, because he had a very short temper. A little while later, some vagrants passing by found the goslings dead outside. The geese's wings were broken. This was in the autumn. Asmund was furious, and asked Grettir if he had killed the birds. Grettir grinned and answered, "When winter comes around, I wring the goslings' necks for certain. And if older ones are there as well, I can deal with them single-handed." "You won't deal with them any more," said Asmund. "A true friend spares others from evil," Grettir replied. "You will be given another job," said Asmund. "The more you try, the more you learn," Grettir replied. "What am I supposed to do now?" So he's now supposed to rub his dad's back, and he decides he doesn't like that. So one day he grabs one of the combs they use for wool and uses that to scratch up his dad's back. He is given a job taking care of horses. Just as he killed all the geese, horribly, he proceeds to flay the horse and then put the skin back on it. And it's just, Grettir is a very awful, unpleasant person. As I mentioned, he very much takes on the anti-heroic characteristics of Egil, where when he's exiled later on for fighting and just being a general malcontent, he doesn't want to help on the ship until the ship is about to sink, and he's down there just bailing up so much water that nobody else can even lift the buckets he's pulling up from the bottom. And so Grettir is an interesting character where we're introduced to someone right from the off that he is not a pleasant person. We're not really cheering for him, and yet as we are introduced to almost the darkest version of him, we start to see the glimmers of light. We start to see how he is human, how he steps up when it's the absolute last moment to step up, the 11th hour, he's there. And so we see these subtleties now being introduced on his character, rather than being presented with this blank slate that seems good, and we see the darkness and the unpleasant characteristics as the person grows. We're introduced to the reverse, and we're working our way towards how Grettir is a human. And that's an interesting choice, I think, from the style of the saga. We do, as I mentioned, start, as with any saga, with a generation in the past. So there was a man named Onund. He was the son of Ofag Hobbler, whose father was Ivar Horsecock. Onund's sister Gudborg was the mother of Gudbrand Lump, whose daughter Asta was the mother of King Olaf the Holy. On his mother's side, Onund was from Uppland, while his father's family came mainly from Rogaland and Hordaland. Onund was a great Viking and raided in the countries west of Norway. And he goes on about these raids, and we learn about Onund and the way that he fights. We learn about the turmoil in Norway, and that remains a key theme throughout many of the sagas, is the relationship between Norway and Iceland, and how in some ways Iceland can be very lawless because it doesn't have the stability of Norway, but in other ways Norway can be a very repressive place where there's almost an autocratic monarchy, and Iceland has much more freedom. And so that is a theme that sort of weaves in and out of the sagas. Grettir, in the first quarter, doesn't really develop that, so we'll see if that becomes something that certainly was important in Njal and Egil's sagas. Onund is very intense. He, at one point, loses a leg. He has it chopped off when he's taking on a lot of opponents. And so he receives a peg leg. And in one battle, the Vikings laughed. "May the trolls swallow you whole, tree leg. May the trolls topple you all." It's not often we see men go into battle who can't even stand up for themselves. Onan said that there was no telling until it was put to the test. After that, they lined up their ships and a great battle ensued. Both sides advanced resolutely, and when the battle reached full pitch, Onan let his ship drift towards the cliff. When the Vikings saw that, they thought he was trying to escape, so they pursued him under the cliff as fast as possible. At that moment, the men who had been placed on the cliff moved out to the edge and launched such huge rocks onto the Vikings that they were unable to withstand the onslaught. A large number of Vikings were killed, and others were put out of action by their injuries. Then the Vikings tried to sail away, but they could not, because by that time their ships had been driven by both the fleet and the current into the narrowest part of the channel. Onan and his men made a vigorous attack on Vigbjord, while Thrawn took on Vestmar, but he made little progress. When Vigbjord's crew began to thin out, Onan and his men boarded the ship. Vigbjord noticed this and urged his men forward while he turned to face Onan. Most of Onan's men yielded their ground, but he told them to wait and see the outcome of his encounter with Vigbjord. Because Onan was such a very strong fighter, they wedged a log under Onan's knees so that he could stand quite firmly. The Viking moved along the ship from the aft until he reached Onan and struck at him with his sword, hacking his shield away where the blow struck. His sword rebounded into the log below Onan's knee and stuck there. As Vigbjord leaned over to jerk the sword back, Onan aimed a blow at his shoulder, cutting off his arm and putting him out of action. Once Vestmar knew that his companion was felled, he rushed for the outermost ship and fled, as did all his men who could make their way there. Afterwards, Onan and his crew examined the casualties. Vigbjord was on the verge of death by then. Onan went up to him and spoke a verse. "See if your wounds bleed. Did you see me flinch? You did not deal a scratch to me, the one-legged slinger of riches. Many breakers of battle axes are more brag than brains." That man was not generous when his strength was challenged. And so we do open with a very memorable set piece. And as we see this family and these friends, how they move forward, and they try to make their way in Norway. They've later tried to make their way in Britain, in the Hebrides Islands, and then ultimately they will later move up towards Iceland. At another point, Onan, when he's there in Iceland, is then deciding where he's going to settle, and everybody has kind of picked out the choice land. So he sees a mountain. He says, "This spear shooter's life wavers a course from right to left, leaving lands and rights. My ribbed ship roams the seas like a tame horse. I have left behind many kinsmen and lands. To reach this pass, I have struck a harsh bargain, swapped my fields for the cold-backed mountain." Which is just an incredible way to describe, the journeys he's been on, the way the imagery that, these Icelandic poets would use, and the way that there truly were warrior poets. It gets at the idea that in some cultures before battles, their poets would go out and have these insult fests before the fight would, begin between two clans or two small armies. And that tradition is very much alive within these stories in an interesting way. But Onan allows us to see a connection. So we see a connection there, and a couple of connections. They discussed the case of Ufig's killing and brought it before the Kjalnar's assembly, because the Althing had still not been established at this time. The Althing, of course, is the law gathering, this gathering where they go and they have their sort of civic government in Iceland. They recite the law, and the people who have great memories will recite the law a couple of times to make sure everybody agrees on it and remembers what it was and shares that within their culture. And so there are events within the saga that predate the Althing, and we see that reference here where we have a character. The case was settled and heavy compensation was paid for Ofig's killing, while Thorbjorn, the champion of earls, was sentenced to outlawry. His son was Solmund, the father of Kari the Singed. They lived outside Iceland for a long time. Kari is the one person who survives in Njal Saga. Spoiler warning. That same autumn, Olaf Filin married Aldis from Bara, and Odd the Deep-Minded died, as is related in the saga of the people of Laxardal. And so, as I mentioned, the Grettir the Strong saga is very much occurring in a world where not only did the events of the people of Laxardal occur, or the events of Njal Saga occur, but those sagas have been written, not just sung, and everybody knows them. And so that the way that this saga plays with the other sagas is really interesting, and the way that those sagas had perhaps in some ways moved from the supernatural that we see certainly in the earliest of the sagas, like the saga of the Volsungs, towards something that was much more naturalistic, humanistic, that was focused on humans and their choices and not just fated and the supernatural. But here we're going to see the way that Grettir the Strong, as the sort of the final great saga, is going to bring back a lot of those supernatural elements in really interesting ways. And so that we have different, fights and conflicts occurring in the Iceland, as I mentioned, was sort of a more free culture, but in some ways a lawless culture. And particularly as the Althing is being established, it hasn't necessarily taken root. And so there's a dispute about, well, who has the rights to something that drifts up onto, from the fjord onto the shore of our lands? Is that my right or your right? Who shares that? And so a whale pops up, and everybody wants to go get a piece of whale, and justifiably they want a piece of it, and then a massive brawl breaks out. And so this song was made about the incident. I heard they were rather hard, the weapons wielded at Rifskir. Many men struck out, armed only with strips of whale meat. The metal Goths gave as good as they got. They lobbed lumps of blubber. That was a brawl, not a battle. And that's kind of an indication of what we'll see more and more across Grettir the Strong is outlandish escapades that also seem totally human, like the way it's sketched, where we can imagine all of the characters fighting, and we're told which character used a whale bone and was just bashing people with it as a club, and all of that really does work to startling effect. Grettir continues to just get in trouble, though. Now that we've caught up to Grettir, he continues to get in trouble. He mentions, of course, things like trolls. He blames this assault he commits on a troll. Has his adventure on the boat, and so he has sort of left at the hall when everybody else leaves at Yule time to go celebrate. And this ship arrives with a set of Vikings. And Grettir, who has not ingratiated himself with his host, is there with the host's wife and daughter and sort of the lower level meniaries within the household, not the top warriors who have all gone with his host to this celebration. And he brings the Vikings up and invites them into the house. He seems like a traitorous guest because he invites them in. He makes it clear that the host is gone, the best warriors are gone, basically do whatever you want. And the women are justifiably terrified. And then Grettir says, hey, this is where we're going to go, though. Come here, over here. And he leads them into this room and he locks the door behind him in this sort of house, this other building on the property. And he goes and he says, listen, I'm going to fight him. And he gets a spear, he gets some armor, and he proceeds to annihilate the 12 Viking warriors. There's mentions as well in this story of berserks, and the idea of the characters who would, perhaps it dates from characters who would put on like bear hides or bear shirts and then take on the attributes of a bear in battle. And were mentioned as well with a group that are called wolf shirts, who the arrows sort of bounce off of their wolf skins that they're wearing. So Grettir goes and faces them and just absolutely destroys them. And it's another indication that we're dealing with someone who is superhuman in some ways, who's not, he's not just an anti-hero the way Ego was. He really is taking on these attributes that are much larger than life. In contrast to the more human-focused characters we had seen in earlier sagas. And that's sort of where we're left off at the end of these fights. We do, however, have just one last incredible set piece. One day, when Grettir and Arnbjorn were walking around the streets of the town to keep themselves amused, they went past a gate, and a man suddenly rushed out, brandishing an axe with both hands, and aimed a blow at Grettir. Not expecting the attack, Grettir was slow to react. Arnbjorn saw the assailant, grabbed hold of Grettir, and pushed him so hard that he fell to his knees. The axe struck him on the shoulder blade, ran down it, and out under his armpit, causing a deep wound. Grettir swung round, drawing his short sword, and recognized Hiarandi. The axe had stuck in the ground. Hiarandi was slow in pulling it back out, and Grettir struck at him, slicing off his arm at the shoulder. Then Hiarandi's companions ran up, 5 of them in all, and a fight ensued. Grettir and Arnbjorn made short work of it. They killed Hiarandi's 5 men while one escaped and went straight to the Earl and tell him the news. And so we have those detailed action set pieces that are a hallmark of the best sagas. But we also have mention there of Grettir's short sword, which was given to him as a reward when he had, defended the house from the ship of Vikings earlier in the saga. And it was a special sword that had been, not bequeathed to the man who was Grettir's host, but had rather been sort of buried in a mound. And the way that Grettir found the mound and slayed the creature that was there, and it is, again, sort of an element of the supernatural. There's almost a way in which he describes that character as a dragon or as a troll. And we're not left to totally understand what that was that he met under this mound, this creature that doesn't seem to have been a person. And so that's just, hopefully there will be more of that to come as we continue enjoying Grettir Saga. So this was the first quarter, and each Sunday we'll be continuing to discuss another quarter of the saga. But as I mentioned, this is our main one. We also have the saga of King Hrafn going on, and this is just a wild one. This is a little bit older, but feels equally close in terms of the way that the berserks and the wolf shirts and all of that is mentioned and developed. As I mentioned, there are great references to Njal's saga so far. Equally with Egil's saga, with the Laxardal saga, both of which can be found in the sagas of the Icelanders, and which we've read in the past. And there are some ways in which Grettir comes across, I don't know, almost as like an Achilles type, in a way that we haven't necessarily seen in other sagas. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops. Finally, if you're really interested in seeing how the sagas fit into world literature as a whole, because Grettir the Strong is not just one of the great Icelandic sagas, along with Njal and Egil's saga, it really does serve as a masterpiece of, the literature of the Middle Ages, world literature, and Stephen Moore in the novel makes a great discussion around the Icelandic sagas. So I hope you're having fun, and the journey continues next week. Thank you.